Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fourth session. I hope everyone is doing well and ready today to talk about how to assess and evaluate in EMI. And this is our fourth lecture together. And today we'll be focusing on assessment and evaluation, but we'll also be incorporating some of the other topics that have come up in earlier sessions. Things about planning for EMI, about academic emotions, both for teachers and students. And we'll be talking about these topics: course planning, teaching, and trying to connect them to how we plan assessments and then what assessment tools we actually use. As for an overview of today's session, we'll start by talking about some perspectives from the literature, talk about backwards course design and how we articulate course objectives, and how that can be very important in terms of clarity for us as teachers, but also for students. And we'll make some connections between backwards course design and assessment. After a break, we'll talk about two different types of assessment, formative and summative, and discuss some different options related to those assessment types. We'll look at some example assessment designs and tasks and talk about some possible problems in terms of EMI assessment and some potential solutions. Before we move on, though, with the literature, I'm interested to get some input from you. First, in terms of some reflection questions that I'd like to ask you to type a quick answer in the chat. Do you like tests? Do you like tests? It seems like a simple question. And I can see some responses already coming in the chat. A lot of no's, capital N, capital O, but sometimes. Do you like tests? Good point, Robert. And that was a point that I was going to bring up. I didn't mention whether you were taking the test or you were making the test, because that's a pretty big distinction, right? A lot of people's first reaction, do you like tests? And they immediately put themselves in the test taker's position, right? Oh, I'm taking the test. And that can be a source of anxiety, of stress, frustration. Maybe your heart rate goes up a little bit when you think of taking a test. So we need to keep in mind that our students would have that same reaction, right? Most of them will say, no, they don't like taking tests. And I also didn't specify in that question, is the question related to taking tests in our first language or a language we're fully proficient and confident in, or in a second language like English? Because then the answer might change. If we know it's taking tests in our first language, maybe we would be more comfortable than taking tests in English. So again, we should think about that basic question, do you like tests, from the student's perspective, but also from our own perspective as teachers, because we won't be taking tests per se, but we'll be making tests. So then you could think, do you like making tests? Well, that can be a time-consuming job for teachers, also some cause of stress and pressure. And then if we're making a test in our second or foreign language, that brings another set of emotions. Then we could change the question a bit and ask you, do you like grading tests or do you like marking tests? And could I ask you to drop your answer to that question in the chat? in general, do you like grading or marking tests? For the majority here who've said no, I imagine there could be a lot of reasons. It can be time consuming. We might have to give feedback to students, feedback on their work. We might be checking tests or reading essays, that kind of thing, in a second language. That might take a while. It's certainly time consuming. But we also get to learn more about our course, about our students' ability with our course material and so on. It can be an opportunity to improve our tests, improve the questions, and also get a good understanding of how students are dealing with the material. So there are of course, pros and cons, but we should keep in mind these kind of basic questions. Taking tests, making tests, grading tests, giving feedback on tests. And when those things all happen in a second language, well, there are going to be even more emotions, maybe negative emotions attached. So we want to make sure that we're comfortable with our assessment procedures, with the tests we make, and so on. Thanks for that input. And next, I'd like to get some more input in terms of some polling questions. So some questions about your comfort level in assessing in your subject. So I've just launched this poll, and I hope you can see it. If you can't, please let me know. The statement here is, I feel comfortable assessing my subject in my mother tongue, and a range of comfort levels here. Okay, and we'll stop this poll. We get an idea of where our group stands here, with most saying pretty comfortable, very comfortable when it comes to assessing in the mother tongue. For those of you who answered on the other end of the scale, not very comfortable, somewhat comfortable, assessing in the mother tongue, I would imagine that much of today's session is particularly relevant for you as we go over some basic considerations for assessment regardless of language. Of course, assessment happens regardless of language in L1 courses. We'll be talking about some assessment principles and tweaking them so that they're angled for EMI, but please keep in mind they might also be relevant to your work in your L1 teaching. So if this poll is about assessing in the mother tongue, maybe you can guess what the item is going to be in the second poll. And it's a response to the statement, I feel comfortable assessing my subject in English, not in my mother tongue, but in English. How would you rate yourself here? You can see quite a difference from confidence, comfort level assessing in the first language to the second language. So we'll end the poll there. And I wonder, for those who might feel differently about assessing in the first language and in English, could you type in the chat, why do you think you have different views? What makes assessing in English, what makes assessing your subject in English challenging? What do you think makes assessing your subject in English challenging? And you're welcome to type your ideas in the chat. What do you think makes the subject difficult to assess? Okay, thanks for sharing those thoughts. Some comments about comfort with English. Sometimes it can be challenging to decipher or to figure out what the students mean when they respond. A certain subject could be challenging, particularly in English. Some uncertainty about what to assess. It can be hard, especially in EMI courses when there's the content and the content is delivered through language. It can be hard to know how to give a fair assessment that might cause us more stress as teachers and be more time consuming than if we were doing the same thing in our first language. Thanks everyone for that input. I'll keep those in mind as we move forward. And there's one more poll question at the moment. And this one is about this. Thanks for bringing up the topic of rubrics here. And that's something that we'll talk about a bit later, about having clear rubrics so students know what to expect. And they also help us as teachers reflect on what we expect from students. But here's one last poll. And the statement is, prior to today, I have received special training support for assessing in English. Not counting today's session, have you had some kind of support? Okay, thanks for your input there. So a range of answers, kind of a split between yes and no, with some I'm not sure's, with about 20 votes here saying either no or I'm not sure. That doesn't surprise me then that there's not so much confidence in assessing in English. Sometimes departments, superiors, institutions assume that assessing in the first language and assessing in English is the same thing, but it's not exactly the same thing. And we need to have some kind of specialist knowledge or consider the role of language in our assessments. So for those of you who haven't had any training or support before, at least there's this session today. And maybe everyone here might think about how they can take some of the main ideas from today's session back to your respective departments, institutions, and have this kind of special training for assessing in English with your colleagues. So we'll end the poll there. Thanks again for your input. It gives us a general idea about how much attention this topic is getting and how much it probably should be getting, considering how much time students and teachers spend with this. So we'll move on with the slides. And hopefully you can see the slides. If you can't, please let me know. So we just went through these different poll questions. I'd like to move on to clarify a few terms, at least the English use of these terms. When we think of assessment, we should think of a pretty broad term, assessment. It's the process of gathering and discussing information from multiple and diverse sources in order to develop a deep understanding of what students know. So we're gathering and discussing information from multiple and diverse sources. A little bit earlier, I asked the question, do you like tests? Well, tests would be one of these sources, but probably should not be the only source. So assessment, we can collect information from multiple sources and different types of sources. That word diverse is certainly important for us when we think of EMI, because students will have very diverse English proficiency levels, different strengths, different confidence levels in different skills. So if we collect, for instance, a writing sample, a multiple choice test, an essay, a spoken presentation, then we're getting diverse sources. That's the kind of thing that diverse refers to here. So that's assessment. Evaluation, in my mind, is more like seeing what level someone is currently at regarding, for instance, content knowledge and/or second language ability. So evaluation could be like some kind of diagnostic test at the beginning of a course to see where they're at. And that can be one type of assessment. And we've mentioned testing. Well, testing is a tool for measuring someone's ability. So we can see some distinction between the definitions that I'd like us to consider for today, especially this idea of assessment being very broad, not just a single source of information. And we'll talk about these different diverse sources a bit later. So if we look at the literature on assessment in EMI, we don't have a very solid footing. There is not a lot of research into EMI assessment practices. There's plenty in terms of teaching techniques, strategies, and so on, but not so much in assessment. Here, some experts in the field say, as EMI continues to expand across the globe, there's a glaring absence of research on assessment. So it's not something that gets much attention. If we as EMI teachers have some questions, some concerns about EMI about EMI assessment, research is not necessarily providing a lot of answers at the moment. There are questions that center on what and who to assess, and also how and why assessment should take place. So if we think of what to assess, that would be like what skills, what content knowledge, what abilities in the content and or the language that we want to assess, how to assess, which tools to use. I've mentioned a few: an essay, a presentation, a multiple choice test, and then why assessment should take place in these different forms. So there are certainly plenty of questions. The literature also mentions that research, policy, and practice on assessment for learning in EMI needs institutional buy-in. So we have to have some structures beyond just individual EMI teachers who are trying to get by or doing the best they can in their subject, but we need broader institutional buy-in for departments, for universities to recognize that teachers need support in developing and executing effective assessment in EMI. This quotation also mentions assessment for learning. Could you type in the chat if you've heard that term before, assessment for learning? Just a quick Y or N, please. Assessment for learning. I see, and it looks like maybe a 70%, 30% split, 70% have heard of it, 30%, it might be a new term. Okay, thanks for that input, helpful for me. Because later today, we'll talk about assessment for learning in contrast to assessment of learning. For learning and of learning are two different types of assessment. Back to the literature, it can be challenging for individual teachers to devise content and language integrated assessments. You as content experts in your disciplines know the content for sure, and many of you have language skills, but then to create an assessment that allows students to express the content in another language could be more challenging. And many teachers, many EMI teachers may view assessment as time-consuming and unrewarding. And some of you mentioned in your comments earlier the time that can be involved in marking, especially assessments. The fact that education takes place through a second language seems to have little influence on the assessment processes. Disciplinary content and language seem to influence the process. The middle part of this quote, the L2 seems to have little influence on the assessment processes. Feels to me like this kind of assumption that if a teacher can assess content knowledge in their field in the first language, in the shared first language with students, the same assessment processes should automatically be able to transfer to assessing in second language English. And I would say that's not really the case. That's not fair to teachers or to students. So we need to factor in this language aspect. We can't just assume if we are used to assessing one way in our first language, in the shared first language, we can automatically switch to English and just use the same processes. In a study of Taiwanese EMI teachers in relation to assessment, teachers expressed a choice of assessment practices that reflected their main beliefs about why they were using English in their classes. And the researchers broke these data into three main sections. There were teachers who were using English for teaching academic content, others who were using English to train students in general academic skills, and the third group here, those who use English to create an interactive English learning environment. So the researchers here interviewed a large group of EMI teachers in Taiwan. Maybe some of you were involved in this study, and then made these three categories of teacher views about why am I doing this in English? And I'd like to see which of these groups you think you fall into. So we'll go back to a poll. And it's in response to this statement, my main priority for my EMI classes is or will be, depending on if you have experience or not, these three categories: teaching academic content, training students in academic skills, creating an interactive English environment. You can only choose one of these. Notice the phrase says my main priority. Of course, that will differ depending on discipline. Can we take just another 10 seconds here to get your answers in? Okay, we'll stop the poll there and let's take a look together. You should be able to see the results now. 11 of us said the main priority is teaching academic content, 3 training students in academic skills, and 14 creating an interactive English learning environment. I'd say that your response might depend on your discipline. It might also depend on when in a program or when in a progression you happen to meet your students or you do the majority of your teaching, because there might be some benefits in having an interactive English language environment, for instance, early on in a student's experience. In the first year, for instance, that might be a priority. And then later on in the same program, the focus turns to the academic content. It might depend on more social science-based disciplines might be more interested in interaction. More hard science-based courses might be more focused on academic content, and so on. So a lot of things to consider here, and I've only asked you one question, the main priority, and only allowed one answer. Well, let's take a look at what these researchers thought of in terms of these sets of beliefs and then matching with assessment practices. They found that those whose priority is using English for teaching academic content, they focused mainly on midterm and final exams, so tests. The A here matches the A in assessment. For those who emphasized training students in academic skills, then there were more frequent assessments, weekly assignments, case study analysis, so some kind of hands-on work. And then point C, those who are creating an interactive English language environments, they tended to have more project-based work, student presentation, online forum interactions. So there's an alternative form of participation, interaction that could come on online, not necessarily in person. But you can see how our beliefs as teachers, our main motivations for the classroom on the left of the screen might match up with different types of assessments on the right of the screen. At this point, I'd like to ask you to consider the following two questions. What is different about assessing an EMI compared to assessing in a shared first language? And then a second question, what assessment methods do you currently use for your L1 teaching in the shared first language and then in EMI? And I'd ask you to consider whether you do exactly the same thing, use the same tools, or do you use different ones? Hopefully, the session administrators sent these questions to you a few days ago, so you had a chance to reflect on them. We're going to move to breakout rooms for a few minutes so you can discuss with a colleague or two. Could I ask that you take a screenshot of this slide or a photo with your phone, something so you've got these questions available to you? And so we'll spend, let's say, 8 minutes or so in the breakout room to either share your opinion or listen to others on those topics. Is EMI and L1 assessment the same? That's the first question. And the second one, what methods do you currently use in L1 instruction and in EMI? Does that sound okay to everyone? I hope so. Okay. Then here come the rooms. And you should get your invitation soon. So we'll come back in about 8 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had a chance to share your experiences and views and or hear from others to see what's going on in their subjects. I'd like to ask for some contributions in the chat related to the second question we had there. What assessment methods do you currently use? So if you could type first the subject or the discipline that you teach, and then what assessment methods you typically use, that would be useful information for the group. So could you type that in the chat? what subject are you teaching in, and what are your common assessment tools? Do you use tests? Do students write essays? Do they make presentations? Do they have projects? So we can see already a wide range of topics and different types of assessment tools, exams, quizzes, projects, discussion. Even homework assignments. So there's some outside of class assessment task. Someone mentioned formative assessments, and later we'll look at some kind of formula for balancing formative and summative assessments. When I look at this list, and thanks very much for this list, when I see something like group discussion for the assessment task, then my next question is, okay, what are students graded on during that discussion? Is it, for instance, the quality of the content that they contribute, the quality of their contribution in terms of the disciplinary content? Is it the fluency or the speed that they deliver with, the organization that they speak with? So that there could be these different very specific factors that students could get grades on. And I think it can be helpful to think about those specifics when creating assessment tasks, so students know what they're being assessed on. And so we can give them some examples about how to succeed. The same thing when it comes to presentations, for instance. Okay, what is an A presentation? What is an A contribution to a group discussion compared to a B or a C? We'll look at some rubrics that bring up those topics later. Thanks very much for letting us know what assessment tools you use. And we'll try to factor that in and discuss EMI in relation to those different assessment tools. So we talked about these questions in small groups. Let's shift gears a bit to some broader considerations when we think about assessing within EMI. But first, some reflection questions. These are for you to consider individually. Do your students know when they're being assessed? Do they know, like, okay, this is assessment time, I should be trying my hardest? There can be some questions about when students are being assessed. When we think about formative assessments, some kind of ongoing assessment compared to the quizzes, the exams that some of you mentioned, which would be very clear, okay, I'm being assessed now. But with the formative assessment, students might not actually know they're being assessed, and it would be good for us to communicate that information to them. Another reflection question, are your assessments formal or informal? In other words, are they announced and known to students, like an exam probably would be? Or are they casual and spontaneous, where the teacher just suddenly thinks, here's a good observational opportunity for me. I'm going to factor this in somehow into my assessment. So good to be aware of our own practices and then how we might adjust our practices if needed. And then what do you do with the assessment? Do you use it to inform your own teaching and the choices that are coming up? Or do you use it to measure learning of your content? Or do you use it for both purposes? So some questions for our consideration. We should also consider course goals. And I wanted to mention these two types of education that take place in a second language. One of them has the acronym CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning, which I imagine several of you have heard of. And this is where learning both the content and the language are equal priorities. There's equal weight placed on the content and the language. This usually takes place prior to university, often in junior high school or high school level before university. So the students might get a grade, a content grade, and a language grade in a CLIL class. That's somewhat different than EMI, or how EMI is generally understood internationally. In EMI, the learning of content occurs through English, sometimes at high school, but mostly at university. And so we can see the content and the language have roles to play in both of these. In CLIL, it's very explicit, a balance between the two. In EMI, it's much more the content that's emphasized. So we could ask ourselves, how much emphasis should be placed on L2 English use? There is a division between content and language in EMI, but the content often needs to be displayed through second language English. I put often in parentheses here because we might have options of teaching in English, the students read in English, but maybe they could take a test in their first language, or they could make a presentation in their first language. So depending on what options your course, your department might offer, that's the reason that I put often in parentheses. The teachers need to be able to navigate the distinction between content and language. And we can do this by providing a lot of examples, clear models of successful assessments, clear instructions to students, clear objectives as well. Notice there's an emphasis on the clarity part here. We should also consider students' background when we are making assessment tasks and decisions. Think about student entry requirements or prerequisites to your program, to your course. Those requirements might include L2 English proficiency. We could think about how much subject familiarity students have. Is it a brand new subject where there might not be any background? Or is it some subjects that they would have been studying throughout their school years, and so they have some kind of familiarity with? What kind of previous courses have they taken? And then where is the position of the current course that you're teaching in a progression of different courses? Is it an introductory course? Is it an advanced course? Those points might help inform the kind of assessment practices that would be best for students at a particular level. So we want to keep student background in mind. Moving on from those points then, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about designing course objectives, making sure those objectives are clear. And after the break, we'll talk about how those clear objectives can help us in assessment. But with backwards design, we would first outline where we want our students to be, and then we would plan different steps for them to get there. We can use backward design to articulate our desired results. So you might think to yourself, in my subject, I want my students to be able to, and then you'd fill in that blank after to. These learning objectives, they should be observable and measurable. They have to be something that we can assess with some kind of tangible number, or a tangible number on an exam or a quiz, or tangible evidence through a presentation, through project work, through an essay. Then we can determine acceptable evidence. What evidence will show me that my students met the desired results from number one? And so this acceptable evidence is really the assessment. If we think about what evidence am I going to be satisfied with so I can make a judgment on student ability. And after we've determined the acceptable evidence, we can plan learning opportunities and instruction. Okay, so here's really the teaching part is number 3. Plan learning opportunities and instruction. To help students achieve the desired results, I need to do this as a teacher, and they need to do this as students. So if we think of this kind of formula, it can be very helpful so that we know what to assess and how to assess. Desired results, determine acceptable evidence, and then plan learning opportunities and instruction. In point number 3 here, that's something that we've talked about in previous sessions about what we can do as teachers in the teaching and the planning of our classes. Today, we want to focus more on number 1 and number 2 about planning these assessments. And we can always think about the integration of content and English, because students are going to be receiving information through English and might be expected to produce English as well. So to give some examples of this sample backwards design for EMI, if we think of desired results, we might finish this prompt with something relevant to your own discipline, of course. But as some examples, I want my students to be able to discuss the field in English with experts. Okay, and maybe that particular phrase relates to those of you who mentioned you use small group discussion. Okay. Be able to write technical reports in my topic, in my discipline, in English. Okay, the technical reports. Then I know I, as a teacher, need to make sure students know how to write the technical reports. They need to be able to pitch their safety plan in English. Okay, then I know I need to teach the pitching part and the description of a safety plan. Students need to be able to react and respond to trends in the industry. So they need to be kept up to date on recent trends, recent news articles, recent academic articles, and so on, and be able to react. So they have to be able to understand and then give some response that's acceptable in my field. Those were the desired results. We can match those up with determining acceptable evidence. So they could make presentations. The green matches the green above. If the goal, the result is to discuss the field with experts, well, then presentations might be applicable. Group discussions might be applicable. Write technical reports in English. Maybe that's related to group projects, written reports, and so on. So we've got different types of acceptable evidence that would fit better or worse with the desired results. And like I mentioned, point number 3 is related to the teaching itself. We've discussed some techniques in previous sessions and will do so in future sessions as well. When we pick out verbs in relation to setting clear course objectives, I wonder how many of you have seen this kind of image before that comes from Bloom's taxonomy of learning. Could I ask you to just type in the chat Y or N if you've seen that kind of chart before? Have you heard of Bloom's taxonomy? It looks like close to a 50-50 split here, maybe. So new material for some of you, but a refresher for those of you who have heard of it. This is an idea of how different levels of academic skills, of things that we can do with information, starting with knowledge and understanding being more basic, like at a receptive level, understanding concepts, But then moving up to a more advanced level, we were applying the concepts, analyzing, and then even at the top, being able to evaluate this system and discuss pros and cons of a system, for instance. So we start in this taxonomy with more basic receptive skills. We get to more advanced using the skills or the knowledge, and then even more advanced being critical of different approaches, more integrative of different approaches. And there are sets of verbs that go along with these different levels. And you might think to yourself, in terms of assessment, well, at this basic level, this more basic receptive level, that could be like a multiple choice test or a short answer test, just showing, repeating the information. Yes, I know this. But in the middle of the level, applying, analyzing, students might get a piece of authentic material and have to discuss these concepts from the lower levels in relation to this material. Well, now they're applying it, and that shows a higher level of cognitive ability. I mentioned these verbs, and we could say things like at the basic level, students should be able to define, describe, recall, state. In other words, really just repeat, show the teacher that they know these concepts, these definitions. Fits well with the multiple choice, short answer, fill in the blank type of assessment. Understanding, we might have verbs like explaining, summarizing, discussing. So that fits very well with writing an essay, having a group discussion, writing a summary. Then we might continue moving up, applying, calculating, demonstrating, solving a problem. The analysis can include verbs like categorizing, comparing this approach and this approach. And in some ways, if we're comparing these two approaches, regardless of discipline, we have to already be able to describe, we have to be able to summarize in order to compare them successfully. So that's where we get a higher order thinking skill. And then we can synthesize, and here words like generate stick out, because now the student is expected to do something independently, not just take ideas that have already been introduced, but now they're doing something, generating something independently. And then finally, at the top level, we can assess, justify, judge, conclude. Assess, judge, that sounds like things teachers do, right? Which is typically why they're in the position they are in relation to their respective discipline. So if we're creating clear course objectives, then that also helps us pick assessment tools that do these things. I can assess that students can describe these concepts. I can assess that they can apply these concepts. So we've got some theory behind why we would choose to assess students in different ways at different levels. We could also think, if you're teaching an introductory course, then you might want your assessments to stick towards the bottom of this triangle, because the students should only be expected to do these things. But if you get to more intermediate or advanced level courses, then we should probably have assessments that include verbs that are at the more complex end of this triangle here. When we're picking verbs to use for course objectives, we should make sure that we're picking verbs that are observable and measurable. And there are some verbs that we should generally avoid, something like understand. I want my students should understand this, or my students should know, should learn about, should think about. Those are very vague and not so tangible. It's hard to know how can I assess or give a grade about how much my students think about this topic, or how much my students appreciate this topic. That's not really something that we could judge objectively in the same way that we could with verbs like this, especially at the lower end, where we can say, yes, this is a definition, you got it correct or incorrect. Here's an article, you've written a summary, that summary includes all the relevant points it should. So that's something that we can tangibly judge and assess, whereas these verbs would make that much harder. So if we look just at an example of some course objectives for an imaginary biology course, I'm going to stop speaking just for a minute so you can read through this slide. One of the first things that we should do when looking at these statements is to look at the verb, the choice of the verb next to the bullet point. Explain, think about, identify, interpret. Okay, well, explain, yeah, that relates to knowledge. We can ask students to, in some ways, repeat or regurgitate information that we already know, but we need them to show us that they know. Explain the importance of each step of the scientific method. That's really one part. And then also explain why society should rely on science. The red no relates to knowledge, that basic level in Bloom's taxonomy. So this course objective is asking for that basic level. The second one, think about modern scientific issues, I'd say is a pretty poorly or weakly worded course objective. It's not really something that we can measure. We can't measure how much students think about something. So that one I would suggest eliminating or at least changing the initial verb. Then we get the third point, identify reliable sources and explain why they are reliable. And so there's some kind of analysis, analyzing these sources. And that's a higher order thinking skill. And then interpret scientific figures and tables. Okay, here's a scientific figure. What does this mean in relation to this other item of knowledge? So there's some application, another higher order thinking skill. What I'd like to emphasize before we take a break is that in EMI assessment, sometimes teachers tend to stick to the lower end here, thinking, okay, I'm not as comfortable assessing my students. They're not so comfortable in using English as a second language. So if I just make the assessments easy enough, then everyone can handle it from the teacher and the student side. And that's fine, I would say, for introductory courses early in a term. But then we also want to make sure that we're challenging our students, even in English, to take on these higher level thinking skills. And we can, one way we can do that is by trying to think about how we can incorporate these different verbs and then matching those verbs with some assessment tasks. So if we specify points in this way with a careful verb choice and then helping that verb choice inform our assessment, well, then it's going to help us with our teaching. It's going to help students feel that they're being assessed fairly, that our classes are contributing and helping prepare them for the assessment, because they know and we know the benchmarks. We've stated what the benchmarks are, what the expectations are. With that, I'd say it's time for a break. So can we stop there for 10 minutes to reflect on these topics, assessment in general, some broad thoughts, but then also thinking about clear course objectives. And after we take a break in 10 minutes, then we'll look at some more specific assessment tools. So we'll see you in 10 minutes. Thanks, everyone. Welcome back, everyone. We'll get started again. And in this second half, we'll move on to some more specific practical, at least I hope practical, points about assessment in EMI. And for this part, it'll be mostly me speaking with a few chances for you to add some points in the chat. But here I'd like to talk about these two distinct types of assessments. One that might make students happy, appreciative, motivated, and another type that might make them a bit less motivated or cause some more anxiety. And these two types of assessment are formative and summative assessment. You've likely heard the terms, and I know some of you have already mentioned that you use formative assessment in your practice. To make sure that we're all on the same page here, formative assessment is often used to plan instruction, to give feedback to students. It's often low stakes, and by low stakes, I mean there's not a lot of pressure involved. There's not maybe a large portion of a grade assigned to formative feedback, formative assessment. That's what I mean by low stakes. And formative feedback can take place continuously. It relates to that kind of informal, casual, spontaneous assessment that a teacher might suddenly think, here's some kind of opportunity for me to see how students are doing and then to give them some feedback so they can do better next time. That's what the continuously means. It's not a single date like an exam date. Formative assessment is different than summative assessment, which is used to measure learning, typically at the end of a period of instruction. It's used for assigning grades. And in comparison to formative feedback, summative is very high stakes, especially when there might be just one single chance, a one-off final exam. So very high stakes. So we've got summative, formative, and summative. Could I ask you to type in the chat, which one do you use? F for formative, S for summative, or B for both? This can certainly depend on discipline and also how much time the teacher has to assess students. Because you can imagine formative assessment certainly takes longer than summative assessment. It might also depend on which stage of a program or course that you're using the feedback opportunity. I'd say it's promising to note that many of you already use both formative and summative, because that would be a strong recommendation, especially in EMI, because of this, the one-off high stakes nature of summative assessment. There might only be one skill assessed in summative assessment, like a multiple choice test involves reading and then applying the content knowledge by selecting the correct answer, but it's only the reading skill. If someone is, for instance, a slow reader in English, they would be disadvantaged in that way. Whereas formative assessment, they could submit multiple homework assignments and hopefully get some feedback to improve each time over the course of the term. So we'll talk a bit about these two different types of assessment, but good to keep in mind that a combination of both is certainly beneficial in EMI. If we think about first language instruction, where we share the first language with the students, well, that's where maybe summative, high stakes, one-off, we could expect that we put that kind of pressure on students in their first language. But if we think of taking a high stakes one-off test in a second language, that is probably too much to rely on in the second language because of these variations that we've mentioned before in second language proficiency, the different skills and confidence levels in different skills, and so on. These two types of assessments are also acknowledged in this kind of phrasing, like assessment for learning, which I asked about earlier, if you were familiar with that term. That's really, in other words, formative assessment, assessment for learning, as opposed to summative assessment, which is assessment of learning. And as teachers, we definitely want to have some kind of assessment of learning, have students learned what I hoped they learned during my course. But I would suggest that we don't only focus on the assessment of learning, but we also have the formative type assessment for learning. When we think of EMI assessment, we can think about connecting directly to the evidence aspects of backwards design. Before the break, we talked about this idea of what evidence is going to help me decide if students have met the expected results. So we need to examine content knowledge and related abilities through English, but we should not be measuring English proficiency itself. We should not be assessing English proficiency itself unless our course goals happen to mention English proficiency. Here I say, therefore, translanguaging options can be helpful. Maybe students could read a text in their first language in your discipline, but write an essay in English or write a summary in English. So there's a translanguaging option. Or maybe students need to make a presentation about a subject that they research in their first language, but then the presentation itself is given in English. So you can think about whether these combinations make sense for your discipline in relation to the student comfort level, proficiency level of the groups that you're working with. Another key point is to make clear and explicit to students that their English ability is not what is being judged, assuming that it's not, right? We want to try to reduce any anxiety that they might have, so we can emphasize that as teachers from day one in the class, that it's not your English ability that's being judged, it's the content knowledge. That means we need to overlook language mistakes and try to look for the content related knowledge and abilities that the students are trying to display. So we wouldn't want to, for instance, when grading an essay in EMI, only focus on language errors. Maybe we don't focus on language errors at all, but instead we avoid those language errors and hope that they don't interfere with the students expressing their content-related knowledge. A few more basic essentials, things that teachers can do. I'd recommend providing models or samples of expected output. So if it's, for those of you who said you have, you grade students on presentations, so we should show students maybe videos. Here's what an A presentation looks like and why. Here's what a C presentation looks like and why. So they get these kind of models, they know what's expected. The same thing with reports or essays or summaries and so on. I use the word output here, something that the student has to produce. Well, we as teachers can show them models of what we expect them to produce. We certainly want to provide clear descriptions of assignments of these assessment activities. And we might even include a checklist of requirements. As an easy example, if we think of an essay, does each paragraph have a topic sentence? Does each paragraph include an academic citation? These kind of specific points that we can make clear to students what we expect them to include. We should remember that the student's English use is not in focus for the assessment, but rather they're using English to demonstrate their academic knowledge in our discipline. Rubrics can be very useful for the above, for clarifying both to teachers, so we are clear about what we're expecting, and then so students know what the expectations are as well. I remember a few earlier comments in the chat about some of you using rubrics already. This can be a very clear, permanent way for students to know what they're expected to do, and also revisiting rubrics every once in a while as teachers can help remind us what we're preparing students to do. I'd like to share just a few examples of rubrics that might be helpful for you to model your own rubrics on, depending on your topic. So here, for instance, this is a sample ungraded presentation rubric for an EMI course. So notice it's ungraded. So probably for formative feedback, it's low stakes, just an opportunity to receive feedback from the teacher. It's for a presentation, but of course we could adapt a rubric for whatever type of assignment you're already using. And here the teacher has 3 columns, expert, proficient, novice. Notice that there's not like even grades assigned. It's not like a grade F or D, something low compared to an A, but instead it's these more general terms. And there are different criteria here related to a presentation, eye contact, posture. Those don't even relate to language specifically. But then when we come to the middle of this rubric, we see clarity, fluency, organization of the content. Those are certainly related to language. If we look at the clarity row, for this example, we circled the proficient level. Presentation is mostly clear, language is mostly appropriate for the audience. So here is, in some ways, a nice description. It's also vaguely worded, mostly appropriate. We don't have expectations for EMI students that their language would be perfectly appropriate. That's too high of an expectation, but mostly appropriate for this disciplinary audience. And then maybe the teacher can make some notes, if they have time, about what parts were not so appropriate. And then that's what the student would try to change when they give the presentation for a grade. The next row down with fluency, well, here the comments relate to the rate of speech, too quickly or slowly at times, not throughout the whole presentation, but at times, too softly or loudly at times. So this, again, kind of vague, but also gives the teacher and student some leeway. And if you're interested in reading more of these specifics, especially if you use presentations a lot in your courses, maybe you want to look at this slide later and read it in more detail to see if it could help you in formulating your own rubric. I'd like to highlight that it's important to make sure that there are distinct and objective differences in the wording of each column. Distinctive and objective differences. If we look at the organization of content row and look at the expert rating, which is circled here, the main idea is identified quickly. There are clear transitions. Organization is strategic and effective. We take that description and we need to reduce it in some way for the next level, the proficient column. The main idea is identified, not quickly identified, but identified. Some transitions are used as opposed to clear, and maybe clear and consistent transitions would be even better in that first column. The organization is effective, but not necessarily strategic. So there's a clear and objective difference, and we could explain that to students. Here's another example rubric, and this one is one that I use with student teachers, students that I teach who want to be teachers in elementary schools in Sweden. And they have to make a presentation related on summarizing a chapter from some required reading about language development. What I want to point out are the first two columns: uses English fluently and uses English accurately. And then I've got some asterisks there because I want to explain to students what I mean by fluently for the purposes of this course, what I mean by accurately for the purposes of this course. So I say fluency means speaking without undue hesitations in a way comfortable for and comprehensible to the listener. This presentation is prepared so that extensive reliance on notes is not necessary. So they can use notes for their presentation, but I've tried to word it in a vague way so that they know you can't only read from the notes, but you can also use them as a reasonable support. So I've tried to define what I mean by fluency. The same thing with accuracy: spoken in correct English, free of errors that are part of this course, because it's a course that involves a language learning component. So you might think related to your own topics and disciplines and assessment, is it helpful for you to explain what you mean by these different terms if you use a rubric like this? We talked about different types of assessments: formative compared to summative, formal, informal, and so on. And let's see where some of the ideas that you shared fit in here to these descriptions. Formal, direct assessments would be quizzes, exams, essays, presentations, final projects, something that results in a clear grade itself. This kind of direct assessment. You do this, and I grade the work that you've done for this. More informal, indirect types of assessment can happen when observing discussions, interactions, lecture reactions. Take a minute or two to write down what they've learned from a certain teaching session. Write down one or two confusing points, and that is some kind of lecture reaction. And these informal, indirect types of assessment help both the teacher and student understand where the students are at. There's no grade required. We get some information as a teacher to help us plan upcoming teaching moments. Should I review this topic? Are students ready to move beyond this topic? The students might also get a chance to reflect on their own learning. Do I need to review this point? Should I take better notes? Should I talk to my friend in class about this topic? And you can see if we applied the words formative and summative here, which do you think is which? Which group is which? Here, the top group is more like summative assessment, the bottom group more like formative assessment. Though something like a quiz, well, it could be used in a formative way if it's an ungraded quiz that maybe you have at the beginning of every class, just to help students see where they're at and help you see where students are at. So a quiz doesn't necessarily need to be formal. I mentioned earlier that I would suggest a combination of formative and summative assessment. And this is just a sample of what that kind of arrangement might look like. And it sounds like some of you are already using both. So maybe you'd have some kind of table or arrangement about how different tasks receive points or contribute to a semester grade. In this example, there are some homework assignments, some ungraded quizzes that account for a very small percentage, but a percentage of the semester grade nonetheless, progress tests, news reporting, bringing in some current event that relates to the class and providing a summary of it. Those in blue are all formative, where the teacher can give some quick formative feedback on the student's performance, either individually to each student, but that could be very time consuming and maybe not really necessarily worth the trade-off of, for instance, 5% of the semester grade related to homework. Well, we don't want to spend a lot of time on 50 students' homework for such a small part of the grade, but we could look at the homework and give some kind of general feedback to the whole class. Okay, many of you did this, you should do this instead. Many of you did this part very well. That kind of general feedback would still fit into formative feedback. It doesn't necessarily need to be to each individual student. We've got to think of our own time and energy also. So those in blue are formative. And then we have a summative final test that is worth a big chunk of the grade, but it's not the only thing that accounts for the final grade. Right? So the students have a chance to check in with where they are in this ongoing assessment. You can see some bullet points here. This kind of combination allows for flexibility. It allows for feedback and improvement opportunities. So hopefully the students would recognize that, or we as teachers would help them recognize that. And then they're also helpful because it's ongoing assessment, so we can adjust the pace, the materials, our delivery, and so on. How we use the time in class can be adjusted based on that, those formative feedback opportunities that we've created. So this is the kind of setup. Of course, the numbers and the task types will change depending on the discipline, how long a class is, and so on. But hopefully the combination of those two distinct types of assessment support students in a way, but also hold them accountable for what we want them to learn. Some of the strengths of this kind of combination. Well, we could think of a potential negative if we only used summative assessment. Only summative assessment is often too long for EMI students to wait for input. If they only get this, they're studying, and they only get a summative assessment final grade, they would have little or no time to improve. Especially in an EMI course, we need to give students regular check-ins. Is this going well? Do you need to spend more time on the material? That they need these regular check-ins, and that's what this combination allows us to do. Formative feedback offers opportunities for teacher input and feedback, and that input could be on the content knowledge. It could be on the language, and I'm thinking of not language in terms of, for instance, correcting grammar mistakes, but on the language that's typically used in your discipline, the terminology, the organization that's expected when we communicate in English about your discipline. The research shows a clear link between formative assessment and student motivation. They hopefully would get small, frequent input from you at least, but also rewards in seeing a good score on a formative quiz or positive reactions to a presentation, that kind of thing. And as we talked about in one of our previous sessions, students are not always enthused about EMI courses. So if we create these formative assessment opportunities, maybe we can increase their motivation. They'll realize, my teacher has put in some time in thinking about how to arrange this course so that I can maintain my motivation. I've mentioned the term formative feedback a few times. So you might be thinking, Joe, what do you mean by formative feedback? How can I do that? So I've got some ideas about formative feedback. And you might think of how this formula, how these points can be applied to your specific content area. But formative feedback can include answers, addressing both correct and incorrect answers. So if it's a correct answer, some praise. But if it's an incorrect answer, maybe think about why the student might have chosen an incorrect answer or why they might have given an incorrect answer. Is there somewhere in the material or in the question that students misinterpreted? We can help them with the incorrect answer. Okay, you got off track here, or you forgot to include this part. So that can be helpful formative feedback so they don't make the same mistake next time. Where did they go wrong is something that you might think about when giving formative feedback. We could give some kind of discussion or justification. Okay, you chose this correct answer. Why did you choose this? Can you find it in the text, in the material? What led you to the correct answer, or what led you to the incorrect answer? Where might have things gone wrong? We as teachers can present strategy options for locating correct information, for criticizing information, for critiquing information. So we can present the strategies that we might use as the content experts, the more knowledgeable experts. And then we could add some generalized advice for the future. Okay, here's how you did on this particular task. In the future, do this and try to avoid this. Again, I speak in general terms because I know you come from very different disciplines, but then they've got some kind of formative feedback, something tangible to hold on to for the next time a formative task comes up. Though those are some things that I would recommend in terms of formative feedback. But if you remember, I've recommended a combination of formative and summative. So in that formative feedback, we should also try to make connections to summative assessment. Make clear the relevance to summative assessment in your formative feedback. That's the chance to improve through the formative feedback, but we can tie it to any summative exams, essay work, and so on. So make clear relevance to summative assessment and future work. And that future work could be later on in the course I'm teaching, or your upcoming courses in this program, or your future employment. We should try to show students that there's a systematic relation between formative and summative assessment, that it's not random, but instead we've planned these formative opportunities so that they filter in and connect to that summative assessment. That these formative feedback opportunities are not isolated, but instead they're integrated into this whole backwards design plan that the teacher has made. As we start to come to a close for today, I want to emphasize and re-emphasize some key principles in assessment, and then we'll get to look at a few sample options here. But assessment should be ongoing, use both formative and summative. Formative assessment does not always need to be graded, but it should be used regularly. Summative assessment, we're typically used to end of the term, but maybe also a midterm to give students a chance to improve between the midterm and the end of term. Give effective feedback. We can praise good work and explain why we're praising it. Point out what students did incorrectly and why. We could create progress trackers. How much have they done? What have they learned throughout the course so far? Written and oral feedback are options. Rubrics can help. feedback from peers. These are all learning opportunities. We should ensure that students are prepared, especially for the high stakes, direct, formal, summative assessments. And they should be prepared in terms of the content and the format of the assessments. We should make sure that we give oral and written explanations or instructions, especially if we think of second language English skills. Some might be good listeners or good readers, but not both. So we want to make sure that students are getting the messages in different ways so that we can account for all of their variation in language ability, provide practice questions, model responses, and so on. We should vary assessment forms. And so I'd say consider your content, the 4 main language skills, as well as different learning objectives and Bloom's taxonomy. We talked about that triangle, and it might be very comfortable for EMI teachers to only assess students at the most basic levels. But I would encourage you to provide enough support and models and feedback so that students can start applying the concepts. They can critique the content in your field. And then finally, don't over-assess. Don't assess for no reason. If we have clearly described learning objectives, then we know that's what we need to assess, and we don't need to assess anything else. So that I'd say that there's a very close connection between learning objectives and assessment. On a teacher level, English is certainly important. And so we need to reflect on our own English ability. Your receptive skills are needed because you're the one who needs to understand, possibly work to decipher student knowledge and ability through their second language English production. So that's where your receptive English skills come in. But we also need productive skills because we need to provide feedback, praise, criticism, correction, guidance. Maybe in English, maybe in the first language. That might be a translanguaging opportunity, especially if the student's English ability is not very high, then maybe we can provide that feedback in the first language to make sure they understand how to improve next time. And maybe at the next opportunity, that input could be in English if we've done it early on in the term, in the course, in the first language, but then at some point, okay, we switch to English so that they get at least some English input feedback. And of course, these are skills that you can practice, that you can develop with colleagues, and that you'll develop as you get more experience working in EMI and doing these kind of things. Let's look at some sample assessment opportunities. We've talked about lots of different tools that we can use. I'd like to talk about some that you might be using or that might be new ideas and discuss how they're connected to some of the concepts that we've talked about before. So one of them, perfect, a concept map. And the concept map would look like this. It's related to chemistry, chemical reactions. But you can see here, there's not so much formal language structure or grammar that's needed. I mean, that's what I think of as an applied linguist. Okay, this image, it includes some language, yes, but also the arrows, the position of the items, that can help show content knowledge without an emphasis on language. So you might think, oh, does my content fit into this kind of structure or pattern? If we think of assessment for learning, well, there can be a greater focus on communication rather than L2 proficiency. Communication can come through a range of semiotic, multimodal, multilingual resources. And Hultgren and colleagues say this is a way forward in EMI assessment. We can't focus only on language proficiency. So multimodality, multilingual resources. So here, it's the images that communicate the knowledge, not necessarily the language. The language is present, but it's not emphasized. Another sample assessment could be a capstone project, like a final project. And some of you mentioned you use final projects. Well, this could involve integrated tasks, background reading, data collection, interviewing, report writing, oral presentation. So we can see that there are several different language skills that are incorporated there over a period of time. And so maybe a project ends with some kind of poster presentation in English. So we can see some integration of the 4 skills, not emphasis on any single skill, but an integration of various skills. A final sample assessment could be a portfolio. And again, this can involve several tasks and integrates various language skills. So we might have a portfolio that includes some of these elements in your discipline, and then with relevant preparation and language support. For instance, okay, how do I write a job application in English in my field? How do I ask for a letter of recommendation, and what should that letter of recommendation look for? A mock interview in your field. Okay, so there's some speaking, some interaction. If we move to potential problems with EMI assessment, here's what I would imagine is one of the biggest problems, especially when we're working in a department with multiple teachers. There can be significant variability among teachers. Different teachers on the same course in the same department focus on content and language to different degrees. So if we have that kind of situation where we're worried, oh, what is another teacher doing? Well, we could jointly agree upon model assignments. So on the course that I'm teaching with other teachers, we could say, this is an A presentation. This is a C presentation. We could agree on those models and then share the models with students. That could help keep things consistent. We could have some coordination among teachers to limit variation, to make sure we have the same expectations. And one easy way to do that is to have norming sessions to calibrate grading. So we take some essays, maybe 2 or 3 essays. We each grade them separately, and then we come together and discuss what grades we assigned and why, and try to come to some kind of consensus so that we keep some consistency when it comes to EMI grading. So we have a lot of important decisions to make, especially because there's a profound influence that assessment has on motivation and self-esteem. So when we think of assessment, we should make these decisions, of course, in relation to our content, but also connection to student and teacher well-being, that we don't overwork ourselves. So continuous formative assessment balanced with summative assessment can certainly help in this area. At the same time, it's also important that there's more emphasis on and recognition of the role of language in assessment. Not in the sense that we should focus on language, but that we should recognize that our students are trying to communicate, trying to understand the content through a language that may not be their own. So Hultgren and colleagues say that we should capitalize on the assessment structures already in place. We're already familiar with essay, quiz, midterm, final exam, and so on, but we should grant language a more prominent place within them. Be careful with the way that we word questions and so on. And I'd say that language here should be considered very broadly. Our disciplinary terms, vocabulary, types of texts and discourses, organization, pragmatic use, all of these things are distinct to each respective discipline. So we should keep those in mind. If you remember, one of the first polling questions today was about whether this was the first time that you've had a chance to think about or discuss assessments in EMI. And some of you said this is the first opportunity. Well, you might consider this kind of training opportunity within your own department or institution. You could, for instance, dedicate a staff or faculty meeting to discussing assessment in English, or take one or more of the ideas from this session and discuss it in relation to your specific disciplinary practices. A lot of the examples and the concepts that I discussed today, we talked about in quite general terms, but I hope you can see how it can apply to your specific content and your specific discipline. So that brings us to the end of today. As a quick overview looking back, we talked about some opinions from the literature, looked at backwards course design and course objectives, where we talked about Bloom's taxonomy and these verb choices. And then we spent some time going over formative and summative assessment, different options, and then looked at some assessment designs and so on. So that's all from me for today, but you will receive the slides from the administrators. And like usual, I'd like to finish with one last poll question. Really just what you think about this session and whether it was useful for you or not. I know that some of you have experience with assessment and we're using some of these concepts already, the formative assessment, using a combination of both, but some of you had a bit less confidence with assessing even in first language. So hopefully you've got some idea of the big key terms in assessment, regardless of the language being used. But then what I wanted to do was take some of those concepts and put to the EMI tweak, or add this this language variability as a factor that we consider when we're creating our assessments, when we're giving feedback, when we're assigning grades. So thanks very much for your contributions and your attention. It looks like most of us thought today's session was somewhat or very useful, so I'm glad to hear that. When we meet in 2 weeks, then we're going to be talking about inclusive practices in EMI, and I look forward to that. So we'll sign off and say goodbye for today. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time. Thanks, everybody.